According to tradition, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517, outlining everything he thought was wrong with Catholicism and the Pope. The then recent introduction of the printing press to Europe allowed this paper version of a video essay to be distributed rapidly far and wide across the Holy Roman Empire. This caused a bit of a stir, to put it mildly, and in 1622 the Catholic Church created an institution intended to combat Luther's narrative called Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, or the Congregation for the Spreading of the Faith. Thence comes the modern word propaganda. Propaganda is any piece of media intended to push a certain point of view, typically one particular side of an argument. Often it is misleading or even outright false. It's an old practice, given that lying is an old practice as well, predating even the Catholic Church's attempts to counter the Protestant Reformation. I've even used it myself, just now, to create a combative narrative that the Congregatio was created purely to fight Protestantism, when in reality that was only one of its jobs. It was also tasked with evangelizing to various Orthodox and Eastern churches, as well as to send missionaries to all the new so-called heathens in the new world Columbus had just found. As Garfield famously said, "You are not immune to propaganda." As I mentioned, the concept of embellishing the truth in order to make you seem better is not new. Look at this ancient Egyptian relief. Pharaoh big, you small. Basically the Bronze Age equivalent of the Virgin v. Chad meme, or Handsome v. Crying Soy Jack meme. You know the phrase, history is written by the victors? Well, it's more accurate to say that history is written by the people who write it. That may sound tautological, but really it's whoever makes the record that gets to decide how it's remembered. Sometimes that's the winners, but often it can be the supposed losers, like the monks in the British Isles when they were raided by Vikings. They got to portray the Norse as barbaric invaders who only knew how to destroy, which became the standing narrative about them for centuries in the English-speaking world. But archaeological evidence and stories from Scandinavian peoples paint a very different picture of a complex and surprisingly egalitarian society that valued trade and artisanship just as much as the martial exploits of raiders. History is a social construct, and it is constructed by whomever can make the most compelling story. At any rate, people have been making shit up to justify their positions since we invented writing. Why does Rome have an emperor now? Aren't we a republic? Well, you see, he's a god, so you'd better do what he says. Now, propaganda doesn't have to be outright lying. Sometimes it can just omit inconvenient facts, or just be worded in a misleading way. This really took off during the lead-up to the American Revolution, such as with Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, arguing for independence from Britain. Other founding fathers wrote under pseudonyms, or even just straight up lied, both during and after the war. Lying about the past is how we got so many Confederate monuments all over the country. The Daughters of the Confederacy are the perpetrators of the lost cause myth, that the South was a great and ancient nation with a proud culture who was bullied by the northern aggressors. Slavery was slavery. This war was about states' rights. Just don't ask which particular right they were so keen on defending. Film provided a wonderful new avenue for propaganda, including perhaps the most infamous example of the lost cause myth, The Birth of a Nation. It was the first blockbuster and the first film to use close-ups, tracking shots, and cross-cutting. It's also the reason why the Ku Klux Klan resurged in the 20th century. A little more than 2 decades later, Gone with the Wind continued to spread falsehoods about a glorious Southern culture unfairly taken down by those horrid Yankees. Both films are considered masterpieces of the art form, and both of them are just utter racist and ahistorical nonsense, pure tripe from start to finish. But that didn't stop the US government, the victors of the Civil War by the way, from wanting to get in on the action. The very first winner of the Academy Award for Best Picture, Wings, was made with the assistance of the US military. And honestly, I could make an entire video just on that film. The aerial combat scenes are insane, more so when you remember it was made in the 1920s. Things really started to ratchet up with World War II, and FDR's administration started to heavily invest in Hollywood, including a little studio named Disney. Hey Walt, I need you to do me a favor. Why do you sound like a mob boss? Never mind about that. Ever since those darn Japs blew up Pearl Harbor, things have been getting pretty tense. We need to make sure South America doesn't side with the Axis. Oh, what's that got to do with me? I'm gonna send you on a bit of a field trip down there. They love your fucking duck down there. Oh, Donald? Yeah, I suppose his shorts have been pretty popular in Brazil, but Frankie, buddy, I'm dealing with a strike over here. I don't have time to go on a field trip. Wait, wasn't the tour already planned before the strike? You said that in the Dumbo video, and didn't Pearl Harbor get bombed after the tour? Hush now. I'm taking artistic license to build a dramatic narrative. Where was I? Right. To heck with your strike. Do you want to see Nazis in Argentina? Not particularly, I guess. Then get your tuchus down there, make nice with the spics, and maybe throw up a couple of pictures. To sweeten the deal, I'll even send you a federal loan. I know how much debt that puppet picture got you in. All right, you've convinced me. I'll go. Perfect. Now I just need to figure out what to do with all those Japs we've got in California. I don't know, Frankie. Why don't you just round them up and put them in concentration camps like the Nazis? You know, that ain't a bad idea. It'd be another year before Roosevelt started flagrantly violating the rights of Japanese Americans, but Walt and his artists were shipped off to South America to rizz up our Spanish and Portuguese-speaking neighbors before Mr. Mustache did. They were basically cultural ambassadors and were well received wherever they went. The animators would get mobbed by kids demanding drawings of Pluto, and they met with local artists and learned about how life differed south of the equator. They also traveled up through Central America, but we'll discuss that in the next video when we talk about the Three Caballeros. But when they got back to the US, Walt had to settle the strike, and then the studio had 2 other movies waiting in the pipeline to finish. Nevertheless, they managed to send out the first film to come from that field trip, Saludos Amigos, less than a month after Bambi's premiere. And when you view the finished product, you can see how they managed to get it done in less than a year. It's 40 minutes long, half of it is the grainiest home video live action you've ever seen in a theatrical release, and most of the animated parts don't even give Dumbo a run for its money. This time, they didn't have a strike to justify the staggering drop in quality, merely a pressing need to get the movie out before the war ended, and justify the massive loan they got from FDR. So what did we end up getting? Saludos Amigos is comprised of 4 segments. Donald Duck is a tourist running around Lake Titicaca. We really like saying its name. An anthropomorphized male plane named Pedro, goofy qua gaucho, and easily the best and most memorable part of the film, the introduction of José Carioca in Aquarela do Brasil. But consider our suave parrot the dessert of this 4-course meal. First we need to get through the dry and tough meat, the burnt potatoes, and the pitifully shriveled salad. The film serves 2 purposes. Firstly, and most importantly, convincing Latin Americans that, hey, we're buddies, we're pals, come fight the Nazis with us, look how much we have in common and how much we appreciate your unique and proud culture. Look, here's Donald Duck saying, gracias. Don't you want Donald Duck saying gracias? He can't say gracias if you side with Hitler, just saying. The second purpose is showing the United Statesians that South America isn't a shithole. It has actual cities and people, and they drive cars, and say doesn't Rio look an awful lot like New York or LA? See how much we have in common. Each segment focuses on a different country. Bolivia/Peru, then Chile, then Argentina, and finally Brazil. Brazil! The Lake Titicaca portion in particular feels rather orientalizing. Look how queer and odd these Inca folk are. Donald as a literal tourist doesn't help matters, nor does the fact that half the jokes don't even make sense.
We find the people here divided into 2 classes. Those who walk against the wind and those who walk with the wind.
What the fuck does that even mean? What are you talking about, movie? You know how watching Last Week Tonight with John Oliver sometimes feels uncomfortable because he'll be discussing some serious subject, then suddenly make a dick joke, and it's just this weird whiplash. Saludos Amigos really feels tugged between fulfilling its government-mandated duty to educate the American public about their southern neighbors, and the animators champing at the bit with the crazed bloodlust to make jokes every 30 seconds or they'll die. Instead of just commenting on how indigenous Bolivians use flute playing to steer their llamas, you really felt the need to start playing pan flute jazz and making the llama do the bunny hop. Like, okay, I guess we're doing this. It's also really, really weird watching this 80 years later and being fully unsure how much of this is accurate and how much is just nonsense Walt and the artists invented. Like how in White Wilderness they threw lemmings off a cliff. And if you're one of today's unlucky XKCD 10,000, yes, Disney made a documentary about Arctic animals and lied about lemming behavior, and that's why people assume lemmings are suicidal. It's fucking awful. Remember, even documentaries are propaganda. So pardon me for feeling uncomfortable about not knowing whether this supposedly Incan music is actually authentic or something the musicians made up because they thought it sounded right. Following Donald paddling off to oblivion after too many fuck-ups, we get this weird throwaway line.
Since no cameras are allowed here,
What does that mean? Do you mean no pictures on the plane? But you're literally taking video footage on the plane. Do you mean in Chile? Why aren't cameras allowed in Chile? Did Chileans in 1941 believe taking a picture of someone stole their soul or something? Give me context, movie. Give me context, damn you! Regardless, rather than anything of actual cultural import for Chile, we get Pedro, the baby plane. And, like, really? Is this the best you've got? We've got plenty of trash to look forward to in the package era, don't y'all worry, but I think we might have peaked early here. This is easily the most boring 8 minutes Disney has ever given me. You can't have tension when your villain cannot move. Like, Pedro has to get blinded by fog and accidentally run into Mount Aconcagua in order for anything to happen. This is just the nothingest of nothing burgers. And apparently Chileans felt the same way. Pepo, a popular Chilean cartoonist, was so disappointed by this fucking plane that he created his own mascot for Chile, Condorito, who has been appearing in daily comic strips since 1949 and recently got his own movie. Gaucho Goofy isn't as orientalizing as Tourist Donald, but again we have this issue of having no idea how accurate any of this is, muddied by the animators making jokes out of anything. Like, okay, I guess gauchos had layered saddles, but a literal mattress? Don't be fresh, Disney. It's one thing to poke fun at and be silly about your own culture, it's another thing to go somewhere else and make fun of something you learned about yesterday. Also, this looks nothing like Aria. But I will admit this opening joke is pretty damn funny.
Over countless miles of mountain and prairie, untouched and unsullied by the mercenary hand of civilization.
Just when you're starting to think that Disney has just wasted 40 minutes of your life that you're not getting back, we get to the part that makes it all worth it. Something tells me the Disney artists actually liked Brazil. There's no patronizing, look here at the noble savage, no offensive jokes that make no sense, just a sincere celebration of what the animators found in America's Portuguese-speaking country. And God damn, is that music catchy. I literally start bouncing around and dancing when I watch this part. And for good reason. They picked the two most iconic pieces of Brazilian music, first the titular Aquarela do Brasil, which had only been written in 1939, 2 years before the trip, and is now synonymous with the country almost entirely due to this film. The second is one of my favorite pieces of music, period, Tico Tico. Now I want to just play the whole piece for you right now, it's that good, but YouTube would probably get pissy at me, so instead, I'm gonna sing/scat it for you. I hope you enjoy, or at least get a laugh out of my squeaky high notes. Ba-da-ba-da-bum-bum, ba-da-ba-da-bum-bum, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-da-bum-bum, ba-da-ba-da-bum-bum, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-da-bum-bum, ba-da-ba-da-bum-bum, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-da-bum-bum, ba-da-ba-da-bum-bum, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba, 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 This segment also introduced the world to José Carioca, who is an utter delight. His name basically means Joe from Rio, but he's the coolest bird you've ever met. He was also created and voiced by actual Brazilians, which is probably what makes him feel so authentic. Rather than Donald imposing himself on Brazil as he does on Bolivia, here he is respectful and interested, even as José speaks only Portuguese at him for a solid minute.
Vamos sair por aí, vai conhecer o Rio, vamos a todos os lugares, vamos a Tijuca, Copacabana, Furnas, Urca, Salgueiro, Laranjeiras, Botafogo, Andaraí, Meyer.
And honestly, no notes about that. This part doesn't feel patronizing because José is here as a representative of Brazil, born and bred, and he's not the butt of the jokes. I wouldn't exactly call him a straight man either, though, both for his constant bendiness as well as his ability to make jokes of his own.
Muito obrigado.
This parrot needs to be in more things, Disney. Give me more José Carioca. Put him in Lorcana. Do it, you cowards. So how successful was Saludos Amigos exactly? Well, Brazil joined the war on the side of the Allies just 2 days before the film premiered in Rio, due to the Nazis sinking some of their ships, so that was a done deal regardless. It's a similar story with the rest of Latin America, which all joined the Allies, though all before Saludos Amigos and its companion piece, The Three Caballeros, released. But Disney's Goodwill Tour was in 1941, before Brazil and Mexico joined the war, so it's possible that the trip itself helped convince those countries to join, and maybe the films themselves helped convince them to stay involved. However, what can unequivocally be said about Saludos Amigos is that it put Brazil on the map. The film was popular both there and in the United States, and samba became and remains popular as well. I can't find any actual statistics, but I wouldn't be surprised if US travel to Brazil increased in the wake of this movie. The film also marked a heightening of the burgeoning relationship between the US government and Hollywood, especially the US military. In addition to the Three Caballeros, the Disney studio was commissioned to make shorts such as Education for Death and Der Führer's Face. Even after World War II, the US Armed Forces continued to use Hollywood as their most effective propaganda wing. Studios are offered authentic military equipment to use as well as federal loans or even grants, provided they give the armed forces script approval. This became a lot more obvious after 9/11 with movies like Transformers and Flags of Our Fathers, and even recent flicks like Wonder Woman 84 and Top Gun Maverick. Wikipedia has a whole list of them on their page for the so-called military entertainment complex, and it's wild what you can find on there. Like, why did Jurassic Park 3 need involvement from the US military? A large consequence of this is that the US military is unlikely to help fund your movie if you're critical of them, which is why the films on that list tend to be very flag-saluty. It also makes it obvious when a film has not gotten that sweet, sweet military moolah because they're not sucking up to Uncle Sam every chance they get. So, does it work? Does propaganda work? I mean, clearly it does sometimes. There are people alive today who think the Civil War was not about slavery because of the Lost Cause myth, because of Birth of a Nation, because of Gone with the Wind. And if you've ever wondered where the losers of that lost cause ended up, take a look at a town called Americana in Brazil, which has a certain familiarity to its fashions. Why Brazil? I'm sure it had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that Brazil was the last country in the Americas to outlaw slavery, not doing so until 1888. At least they figured it out eventually. Now, the propaganda of World War II in particular is fascinating to look over. Compare the US with Rosie the Riveter, we can do it, very go-getter, action-oriented, to the UK with keep calm and carry on, very stoic and steadfast and passive. Americans were called to arms while Brits were told to pretend like everything was still normal. And then there's the comparison between the propaganda of the Axis and the Allies. Triumph of the will, also regarded as foundational to film language. Funny how that keeps being said about racist and fascist so-called art, is all about glorifying the Nazi regime, making Hitler and his Reich seem larger than life, something to be taken seriously, to die for. While cartoons made by the US made Charlie Chaplin's lookalike and his brown shirts the butt of every joke. Now, this tended to get racist as well when it came to depictions of Hirohito in the Japanese, but it told Americans that if Donald Duck and Bugs Bunny could beat Hitler, then so could you. Saludos Amigos and the Three Caballeros stand out in that regard, as instead of arguing for war depicting soldiers and fighting, they simply present what it is we were trying to defend, the rich and varied cultures of these two continents called the Americas, and how much we all have in common. So, is Saludos Amigos worth a watch? If you're interested in historical propaganda or want to see a time capsule of how USians in the 40s viewed South America, sure. If you're just looking for some entertainment, I'd highly recommend the final segment in Brazil, but skip the rest. Join me next time as we take a look at what happens when a bunch of animators are allowed to do whatever the hell they want with Uncle Sam's money in The Three Caballeros.